Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the UX Research Club, the podcast dedicated to the field of UX research. I'm Emmanuelle, your host. One of the questions I get asked more often these days is whether AI is going to replace UX researchers. Depending on who you ask, AI is either about to make researchers redundant or simply another tool that we can add to our toolkit. Personally, I think both points of view miss what is, for me, the most interesting question. The real issue isn't whether AI will replace researchers. It is what happened to the craft of research when AI became part of the way we work. And perhaps, even more importantly, what happened when some of the activities that have traditionally helped researchers build expertise are increasingly handled by technology. As I was preparing this episode, I found myself reflecting on some of my earlier work. I went back to reread my book, Practical User Research, which was published in 2020. And I also listened to some of the first episodes of this podcast. In episode 1, in season 1, I talk about the origin of UX research and how it emerged from a range of disciplines, including psychology, ergonomics, human factor, anthropology, sociology, human-computer interaction, and usability testing. In the episode 2 of the season 1, I argue that UX research is far more than usability testing alone. And in the episode 4, I explore one of the key questions researchers face: which method should we use and when we should use it and why? Looking back to those conversations, I was struck by how familiar many of today's discussion about AI actually feel. The tools are different. The technology is different. But researchers have always needed to understand the strengths and the limitations to different methods and use their judgment to decide when and how to apply them. Throughout my career, I've seen the profession evolve times and times again. Started working in the field before UX research was even recognized as a profession. Since then, I've seen digital transformation reshape organization, agile change way products are developed, mobile technology become dominant, remote research become mainstream during COVID, and now AI-powered tools enter into the picture. At every stage, there were predictions that the profession was about to change dramatically. And to be fair, it often did. The tool changed, the processes changed, the way teams were organized changed, even the job title changed. But the core purpose of research remained the same: helping organizations make better decisions through a deeper understanding of people. That's why, in this episode, I want to move beyond the usual debate about whether AI can conduct interviews, analyze transcripts, or generate insights. Instead, I want to focus on a bigger question. Is AI really changing the craft of research? Or is it simply the latest chapter in the evolution of a profession that has always adapted to new technology and new ways of working? And if the craft is changing, what does that mean for researchers today, for research leaders, and perhaps more importantly, for the next generation of researchers entering the profession? To make sense of what's happening, I think it's worth stepping back and looking at how our profession evolved. One of the ideas I've talked about in both Practical User Research and the first season of this podcast is that UX research didn't just appear out of nowhere. It grew out of several disciplines that has been around for a long time, before anyone had the job title of UX researcher. Before UX research existed as a recognized profession, psychologists were studying human behavior and decision-making. Market researchers were helping organizations understand their customer. Anthropologists and ethnographers were observing people in their everyday environment. Human factor and ergonomist specialists were focused on how people interact with product, system, and technology. And usability practitioners were identifying problems and improving experiences. Over time, these different disciplines started to come together. We began to see dedicated UX researcher, then senior researcher, lead researcher, senior managers, head of research, research operations specialist, research strategist. And now I've seen another wave of change with new role emerging around AI. Researchers who use AI as part of their practice, specialists focused on AI within the research team, new ways of working where AI is becoming embedded in research process itself. If you look back over the last 2 or 3 decades, almost everything about the profession has evolved. Job title has changed, team structure have changed, tools have changed, technology has changed, but the core purpose has stayed largely the same. Research exists to reduce uncertainty and help organizations make better decisions. That was true when research was conducted with notebook, clipboards, and post-it. It was true where usability labs became common. It was true during the rise of digital products. And it was true when teams shifted to remote research during COVID. And it is still true today. That's why I don't think we should treat AI as if it was created a completely new profession. It hasn't. What we are seeing in the next stage of the evolution of a discipline that has always adapted to new technology, changing business needs, different ways of working. The profession has changed many times before, and it will continue to change. The real question isn't whether change is happening. The real question is which parts of the craft are changing, which parts remain the same, what that means for the future of research. So if research isn't disappearing, what is actually changing? Personally, I don't think AI is replacing researchers. We still need people to define problems, design research, recruit participants, interpret findings, communicate insight, and help organizations make better decisions. None of that is going away. If anything, those responsibilities are becoming even more important. What I think is changing is where researchers spend their time. Traditionally, a huge part of the job has been processing information, taking notes, coding interview, tagging data, doing synthesis of findings, building report and presentation. A lot of our effort has gone into turning raw information into something useful and actionable. Now, AI can help with many of those tasks. It can transcribe interviews, it can identify pattern and theme, it can generate summaries, it can organize large amounts of information far faster than any person can. But that doesn't make researchers less valuable. It changes where their value sits. I think the future value of researcher will be less about processing information and more about evaluating it. Less about producing output and more about applying judgment. Less about generating answer and more about questioning them. The skills that matter most aren't really new. They are the skills that great researchers have always had. Judgment, critical thinking, curiosity, challenge, oversight, making sense, decision support, the ability to spot when something doesn't go quite right, the ability to recognize what is missing, the ability to connect evidence to real business decisions. In many ways, this connects directly to something I discussed in the episode of The Illusion of Understanding. One of the risks of AI is that it can create the appearance of understanding without necessarily achieving it. It can produce convincing summaries, confident explanation, well-structured output. And because those output looks polished, it is really easy to assume they are correct. But looking correct and being correct are not the same thing. Researchers have always been trained to question evidence, challenge assumptions, and look beneath the surface. Those skills become even more important in a world where information can be generated instantly. The danger is not necessarily that AI gives us no answer. The danger is that it gives us an answer that feels plausible enough that we stop asking questions. That's where researchers add value, not by accepting output at face value, but by interrogating them, testing them, validating them, understanding their limitation, and ultimately deciding whether they should influence a decision. This is also where responsibility becomes increasingly important. As AI become embedded in research workflow, someone still needs to be accountable for the quality of the work. Someone needs to take responsibility for the conclusion being drawn, for the recommendation being made, for the decision being influenced. That responsibility cannot simply be delegated to a tool. Researchers will increasingly need to act as stewards of evidence, not just generating insight, but ensuring those insights are robust, ethical, and fit for purpose. And I think there is another shift happening as well. In an AI world, understanding people alone will not be enough. Researchers will also need to understand organizations, business models, operations, and strategy. The researcher who create the greatest value will be those who can connect human understanding to business decision. Because research does not exist in isolation. Insight only create value when they help organizations make better choices, solve real problems, and achieve meaningful outcomes. The ability to connect evidence, human behavior, and business context may become one of the most important capabilities a researcher can develop. But I also think the role needs to become broader. For a long time, researchers have often worked within fairly defined boundaries. We generate insight, hand them over, and move on. I don't think that's enough anymore. Researchers need a much deeper understanding of the organization they support. They need to understand commercial objectives, financial performance, operational realities, how decisions are actually made. The better we understand the business context, the more useful and influential our insights become. I also believe collaboration will become increasingly important. Research can't operate in silo. Researchers will need to work more closely with analytics team, business intelligence team, finance team, and specialists responsible for markets and industry data. Each discipline brings something different. Researcher helps us to understand people, analytics helps us to understand behavior at scale, business intelligence helps us to understand performance, finance helps us to understand commercial outcome, market data help us understand the wider competitive environment. The researcher can bring all those perspectives together with a much stronger position to influence decision. And the important point, the UX researcher bring context. In many ways, I think researchers will face a challenge that is very similar to leadership. Leaders don't do everything themselves. They need to know what can be delegated and what can't be delegated, and what requires careful oversight. Researchers will increasingly need to make the same judgment call. What can be handled over AI? What should never be handled over AI? Which output can be trusted? Which output needs to be checked? Where are the risks? Where are the blind spots? And perhaps, more importantly, what question should we be asking that AI isn't asking? For me, that's the real shift. We are moving from processing information to questioning information. The future researcher isn't someone who does less research. It is someone who spends less time processing information and more time challenging, interpreting, and validating it. It is someone who understands the risk of the illusion of understanding and recognize that confidence is not the same as truth. It is someone who accepts responsibility for the quality of evidence being used and make decisions. And it is someone who understands the broader business, work across disciplines, and bring together multiple sources of evidence to support better decision. That's a very different conversation from simply asking whether AI will replace researchers. If researcher is moving up a level, then I think researchers will need to broaden their capabilities too. This isn't a completely new idea. I've seen something similar happening with research ops. 10 years ago, most researchers weren't thinking much about repository, participant panel, governance, toolings, consent form management, and operational processes. Then research ops emerged as its own discipline. Research of specialists develop deep expertise in those areas, but over time, researchers also need to build a working understanding of them. Today, most researchers understand the basis of participant recruitment, consent form, repositories, governance, even if they don't consider themselves as research of specialists. And I think AI will follow a similar path. Not every researcher needs to become a data scientist. Not every researcher needs to become an AI specialist. But every researcher will need a practical understanding on how AI fits into their work. They will need to understand what AI does well, what it struggles with, where it can create efficiencies, and where it can introduce risk. Because AI is quickly becoming part of everyday research practice. They will also need to learn how to work effectively with AI. For me, the most important skill is discernment, knowing when to trust an output, knowing when to question it, and knowing when to ignore it altogether. AI can produce answers incredibly quickly, but speed is not the same as quality, and confidence is not the same as accuracy. Researcher needs to understand both the strengths and the limitation of those tools. And in many ways, I think the future researcher become part practitioner and part quality controllers. We will still be responsible for conducting research, but we will also spend more time ensuring the quality of the research process itself. That means validating evidence, challenging assumptions, identifying risk, and making sure findings are generously supported by the data. This becomes even more important as AI improves at analysis large volume of qualitative and quantitative data. An AI-generated summary of interview might be useful. An AI-generated analysis of survey responses might be useful, but neither should be accepted without scrutiny. Researcher needs to understand how those outputs were created, what may have been overlooked, what bias may have been introduced, and whether the conclusion actually stand up to examination. The value of researcher is not simply producing outputs. It is making sure those outputs can be trusted. The technology can help us, but responsibility for the quality, validity, and reliability of the work still sits with us. One of the things I've noticed in the recent conversation about AI is that a lot of discussion focus on experienced researcher. Will senior researcher be replaced? Will researcher leader still be needed? Will AI reduce headcount? But I sometimes think we are looking in the wrong place. The people I worry least about are experienced researchers. The people I'm most concerned about are the next generation of researchers and those just entering the profession, because expertise doesn't appear overnight. Expertise develops through experience, through repetition, through practice, through making mistakes and learning from them. You become a strong researcher because you have conducted interviews, you have analyzed data, you have struggled with messy findings, you have made incorrect assumptions, you have missed things, and over time, you have learned to recognize patterns, identify risk, and develop judgment. That is how craft develops. And that is where I think we need to be careful. If AI starts performing many of the activities that traditionally help researchers develop expertise, where will future expertise come from? How do junior researchers learn to conduct interviews if they rarely moderate interviews themselves? How do they learn to conduct analysis if AI performs the first round analysis? How do they learn judgment if they haven't spent years navigating across messy and often contradictory data? This challenge isn't unique to the UX research. We are seeing similar discussion in software engineering, in education, in law, in consulting. In many professions, technology is beginning to automate part of the learning journey. Throughout my career, I have constantly recruited junior researchers. In fact, some of the strongest researchers I've worked with started their career in junior roles. I have always believed organization is to invest in the next generation, not just because it's the right thing to do, but it's how a profession continues to develop. Junior researchers bring fresh perspective. They challenge established thinking. They become future specialists, future leaders, future head of research, future executive. And yet, if I'm honest, I don't see many junior researcher roles today. Many organizations already prefer to hire experienced researchers who can deliver quickly and independently. AI may accelerate that trend. If organizations can automate part of the execution, the temptation would be to hire fewer junior people and more experienced ones. But that creates a long-term problem because expertise cannot simply be downloaded. It has to be developed. And that leads to what I think is one of the most important questions facing our profession. If organizations increasingly recruit experienced researchers and increasingly rely on AI for execution, where will the next generation of senior researchers come from? Because every senior researcher was once a junior researcher. Every head of research was one learning how to conduct their first interview. Every expert developed their expertise through practice. The future of our profession depends not only on how we use AI, but it also depends on how we continue developing the next generation of researchers and junior researchers entering into the field. Before, we assume AI is unlikely anything we've seen before. It's helpful to remember that many technological advancements have triggered similar debates. I can remember when scientific calculators became common. At that time, they were real worried about how this would affect the learning of mathematics. Students were expected to work through formula by hand. Calculators were often banned or heavily restricted in exams. Many people believed that students would lose important mathematical skills. But that didn't happen. What changed was that calculation became quicker and easier. The focus of expertise shifted. Students still needed to understand mathematical concepts. They still needed to know which formula to use. They still needed to judge whether an answer was reasonable. The calculator simply took over the part of the calculation process. And I think we saw something similar in statistics. In fact, if you listen to the previous episode on choosing the right research method, you will remember that selecting a method is often one of the most important decisions a researcher makes. When I study statistics, we spend time learning the formulas behind different tests. We learn about t-test, ANOVA, MANOVA, chi-square test, etc. We were expected to understand how those methods work and why they were used. Then software packages like SPSS became widely available. Researchers no longer had to perform every calculation manually. The software could do that for them. Today, many researchers use tools such as R, which can analyze large data sets and automate complex statistical analysis. Once again, much of the calculation process became automated, but statistical expertise didn't disappear. What changed was where that expertise was needed. Researchers still had to choose the right method. And as we discussed in previous episodes, choosing the wrong method can lead to misleading or invalid conclusion, no matter how sophisticated the software is. They still needed to understand the assumption behind the analysis. They still needed to recognize mistakes and limitations. And most importantly, they still needed to interpret the finding correctly. The technology reduced the manual workload. It did not remove the need for expertise. And I think that is the key question for us today. Perhaps AI is not replacing expertise. Perhaps it is changing the type of expertise that researchers need. Future researchers may spend less time producing output and more time evaluating them. Less time gathering and processing information and more time making sense of it. Less time running analysis and more time deciding whether the result can actually be trusted. If that is the case, then the challenge is not about holding on to old ways of working. The challenge is understanding what new skills and form of expertise researchers need to develop in the AI-driven world. This takes me back to something I talked about in earlier podcast episode, The Illusion of Understanding. One of the reasons I'm conscious about some of the claims being made about AI qualitative research is that there is a big difference between analyzing language and understanding people. AI is incredibly good at processing information, and it can analyze transcript, spot theme, identify patterns, summarize huge amount of text. And in many cases, those capabilities are extremely useful. But qualitative research has never been just about analyzing words. As researchers, we are not only interested in what people say, we are trying to understand what they mean, how they behave, what influences their decisions, and what is happening in the wider context around them. And for those of us working in business and organizational setting, we are also trying to understand how those behaviors connect to commercial realities, how customers make decisions, why employees adopt or resist change, how teams collaborate, why products succeed or fail, and how organizational culture shapes outcomes. That is a much more complex task because people don't always say exactly what they mean. They don't always do what they say they will do. Anyone who has spent time conducting interviews, observation, or ethnographic research will recognize this immediately. People hesitate. They change their mind. They contradict themselves. They become uncomfortable when certain topics comes up. And sometimes there is a gap between what people say and what they actually do. The same is true in business context. Customer may say price is their biggest concern, but constantly choose premium products. Employee may support a new strategy in principle, while continuing behaving in the same way they always have. Leaders may believe a process is working effectively, while the people using it every day experience something quite different. Often, the most valuable insight isn't found in what they say. It is found in what was not said. It is in the pause before the answer, the hesitation in someone's voice, the look they give another person in the room, the tension that appears when a particular issue is raised, the environment they are in, or the social dynamic shaping their behavior. In organizational setting, it can also be found in the gap between official narrative and everyday reality. The difference between what appears in report and what actually happened on the ground, the information practices that shape behavior far more than formal policy. They are the kind of things that don't always show up clearly in a transcript. And even when they do, it's not always easy to understand what they mean without seeing the situation for yourself. This is where I think we need to be careful. AI can sometimes create the impression that transcripts contain the whole story. But anyone who has done qualitative research knows that's rarely true. A transcript is only one part of the picture. The words matter, but so does the context, the behavior, the environment, the emotion, the contradiction, business reality, the organizational incentive, the cultural norms, the things people struggle to explain, and the thing they choose not to say at all. That's why I think this distinction becomes even more important as AI continues to improve. AI can analyze what was said. Researcher needs to understand what was actually happening. In many cases, what that means for the organization, the customer, or the business decision being made. Those are very different things. In fact, the better AI become at analyzing language, the more valuable human observation may become. Because truly understanding people has always required more than analyzing their words. It requires interpretation, judgment, context, empathy, business understanding, and the ability to see beyond the transcript. Interestingly, one possibility that receives very little attention is that AI may actually increase the value of field research. Over the last few years, especially during and after COVID, so much of our work shifted online. Interviews moved online, usability testing moved online, workshops moved online. Research became increasingly centered around Zoom call, recording, and transcript. For many researchers, that simply became the way we work, and there were plenty of benefits. It was quicker, less expensive, easier to scale, and we could recruit participants from almost everywhere. But as AI gets better at analyzing digital information, I think we need to think differently about where our value as researchers come from. If AI can analyze transcripts, summarize interviews, spot pattern, group theme, and generate report, then maybe our value isn't in processing information anymore. Maybe it is in collecting information that never made it into the transcript in the first place. That's why I think field research become even more important. Contextual inquiries, ethnographic research, workplace observation, home visit, field study, face-to-face usability testing. These approaches allow us to see things that never made it into the data at all. We see the environment people work in, the shortcut, the workaround they create, the interruption they deal with, the frustration they experience, the informal behavior that shape decisions, the interaction between people, the reality on how organizations actually function. And often the difference between what people say they do and what they really do. Looking back at my own career, many of those valuable insights I have discovered didn't come from the interviews. They came from observation, from watching people in their natural environment, from seeing how work was actually done, from understanding the context around decisions, and from noticing things that participants never thought to mention. In some ways, I think our profession may need to reconnect with its root. Before remote research became so common, observational research played a much bigger role. Researchers spend time in office, call center, factories, hospital, home, school, trading floor. They immerse themselves in the environment they were trying to understand. I think there is real value in returning to some of those practices, not because technology has failed, but because technology changed the area where human expertise is most needed. The more organizations rely on AI-generated analysis and summary, the more valuable researchers become when they spend time observing people in the real world. The more AI focuses on language, the more important it becomes for us to understand behavior. And the more organizations rely on digital data, the greater the value of researchers who can provide context, observation, and a deeper understanding of people. One of the great ironies of the AI era may be that it takes us back to some of the oldest and more effective methods we have as researchers. This is something I've been thinking about quite a lot lately. What should university and research courses actually be teaching the next generation of researchers? For me, the answer is not to move away from traditional research training. If anything, it's the opposite. As AI becomes more capable, having a solid grounded in the fundamentals become even more important. Students still need to learn the basics of good research. Research design, sampling, bias, interview, observation, analysis, critical thinking. Without those foundations, it becomes much harder to judge whether research findings are credible or whether an AI-generated output can be trusted. Researchers need to understand how evidence is produced before they can properly assess the quality of that evidence. This is not just a challenge for UX researchers. It applies across many research disciplines. Whether someone is working in market research, social research, behavioral science, healthcare, education, policy, or academia, the same principle remains true. If researchers don't understand how evidence is created, they will struggle to evaluate whether it is robust, recognize its limitation, or challenge conclusions that appear credible but may be misleading. And at the same time, university and professional training provider needs to recognize that the role of the researcher is changing. Future researchers will need skills that go beyond traditional research method training. They will need strong judgment, the ability to bring together information from different sources, the ability to communicate insights clearly and tell a compelling story with evidence, the confidence to facilitate conversation and influence decision-making. They will need a solid understanding of ethics, a practical understanding of AI, including its strengths and its limitations. And perhaps most importantly, they will need excellent observational skills. The ability to understand people in context, to spot what isn't being said, to recognize inconsistency, to look beyond the transcript, Many of the tasks that once made researchers stand out are likely to become increasingly automated. The skills that will remain valuable are the ones that are most difficult to automate: judgment, interpretation, context, empathy, critical thinking, and the ability to turn evidence into meaningful decisions. If I were designing a university program or a research course today, I wouldn't reduce the focus on the foundation of research. I will place even more emphasis on teaching students how to question evidence, how to challenge assumptions, how to critically assess AI-generated output, how to combine different sources of information, and how to understand the wider business, organizational, and human context in which research takes place. I would also make sure students gain practical experience using AI alongside traditional research methods, so they understand both the strengths of those tools and their limitations. Ultimately, I think universities and course providers need to start asking a different question. Not what can AI do, but if AI can support parts of the research process, which human capabilities will become most important for the next generation of researchers? Because that's where researchers will continue to add value. And that's where the next generation of researcher leaders will come from. As we wrap up this episode, I want to come back to the question we started with. What happens to research craft when AI becomes part of the research process? Personally, I don't think research craft is disappearing. I think it's changing. And to be honest, that's nothing new. Research has always evolved. We have adapted to new tools, new technology, new ways of working, and changing expectations from organizations. AI is simply the latest development in that ongoing evolution. What hasn't changed is, why do we do research in the first place? We are still trying to understand people. We are still trying to reduce uncertainty. And we are still trying to help organizations make better decisions. What is changing is where researchers add value. Some tasks will become automated, some part of the workflow will become faster and more efficient, and some skills that have traditionally been important may become less central over time. At the same time, other skills become even more valuable: judgment, interpretation, observation, critical thinking, understanding context, ethical decision-making, and the ability to turn evidence into meaningful insight that help people to make better decisions. So for me, the biggest question isn't whether AI can do research. The biggest question is whether we can continue developing researchers who understand the craft well enough to challenge what AI produces. Researchers will know when an output makes sense, when it doesn't, when something important may be missing altogether, because expertise has never been about generating answers. It is about understanding where those answers came from, recognizing their limitation, and knowing what they actually mean. That's why I don't think the future of UX research will be decided by AI alone. I think it will be shaped by how effectively researchers apply judgment, oversight, and critical thinking alongside this technology. Thank you for listening, and I will see you in the next episode of the UX Research Club. Goodbye.